Have you ever asked yourself what would you do if in one split second the line between enemy and human being vanished? Would you follow the code that's kept your family safe, or risk everything on a single act of mercy that could change the fate of everyone you love? This is not just a story about the wild frontier or the men who carved their names into its dust, but about the moments that define who we are, even when no one is watching. Let me take you back to a time when the only thing more unforgiving than the land was the choices a man made. The sun was barely up that morning in 1847, its red glare cutting through the Texas haze like the edge of a fresh, sharpened blade. I remember how dry the wind felt against my face, how every step crunched over brittle earth that hadn't seen a decent rain in months. My ranch was all I had left in the world, a few rickety fences, a weary old barn, and the well a lifeline that could turn on you as quick as a rattler if the water went bad. Most days I kept to myself. Folks out here didn't take kindly to outsiders or strangers, and after losing my wife to the fever 2 winters back, I figured the less I owed anyone the better. Just me and my boy Eli trying to hold on to what little we had. But that morning the world didn't feel right. I noticed it first in the silence, no meadowlark song, not even the far-off yapping of a coyote. Just the steady beat of my own heart, and the distant clang of Eli working on the fence. Then I saw it, a thin trail of blood, dark as old wine smeared across the pale dust. It snaked from the edge of the woods, past the barn, and led straight to the one place that mattered most, the well. I felt my pulse jump. In Texas, a blood trail meant trouble, and trouble out here rarely traveled alone. I gripped my rifle tighter, mind racing with possibilities. Wolf attack, maybe a deer clipped by a stray bullet, but the drops were too big, too fresh, scattered like someone half running, half staggering in the dark. Fear settled in my gut, heavy as a stone. I called out to Eli, telling him to stay put and not come near the house, but I could see his small figure, brown hair, tangled in the wind eyes wide peering from behind the fence posts. I didn't want him to see whatever was waiting by that well. Lord knows a boy of 8 shouldn't have to learn what men are capable of, not just yet. As I rounded the corner, I caught sight of him, a young man, dark hair matted with sweat-copper skin, smeared with blood, and dust slumped against the stone wall. His chest heaved with ragged breaths, one hand pressed to a wound in his side, the other clawing weakly toward the bucket that hung just out of reach. Even half dead, there was a pride to his posture, a refusal to beg, but in his eyes I saw something that cut deeper than any wound desperation, and the hope that someone, even a stranger, might not turn him away. I knew what he was even before he managed to croak out a word. Apache. Every neighbor for 50 miles would have shot him where he lay, buried the body deep, and never breathed a word. That was the law of the land, fear disguised as justice. Out here, Indian meant danger, and nobody cared about why. The old stories, the raids, the burning cabins, folks clung to those like gospel. And yet, as I looked at this boy, no older than 20, his lips cracked and trembling, the blood already drying on his shirt, I didn't see a monster. I saw a human being dying of thirst. For a second I froze. My father's voice echoed in my head. Out here, kindness will get you killed. But in that same moment, I remembered something I'd nearly forgotten, a summer long ago, the year the river ran dry, and I thought I might not live to see another fall. Back then, it was a stranger who found me, gave me water, no questions asked. I owed my life to a man whose name I never learned, and the memory flared in my chest, stubborn as a prairie fire. I looked down at my own son, who'd crept closer now, eyes fixed on the Apache, the question plain on his face. What will you do, Pa? What lesson would I teach him, mercy or fear? The young Apache's lips moved barely more than a whisper. Water, he rasped the word, strange and heavy in the still air. For a heartbeat, time stood still. I thought about the risks, the neighbors, the law, the fact that a single wrong choice could bring violence to my doorstep. But I also saw Eli's hand twitch as if he wanted to reach out. I saw the way the stranger's body trembled, not just from blood loss, but from the humiliation of having to beg an enemy for a sip of life. I lowered my rifle hands shaking and reached for the bucket. The water was cold, pulled fresh from the well, and as I pressed it to the Apache's lips, I saw his eyes widen, saw the life flicker back for just a second. Eli stepped forward, holding out his own small canteen, his voice soft. He looked scared. "Pa," I nodded, unable to speak. In that instant, the boundaries I'd been taught, white man, Indian friend, foe, blurred and then vanished. All that was left was a wounded boy, a desperate father, and the knowledge that sometimes the only thing more dangerous than an enemy is the fear that keeps you from seeing his humanity. The sun climbed higher, lighting the blood on the dirt, like a warning. I knew what was coming, the questions, the suspicions, maybe even the noose. But as I watched my son offer water to a stranger, I realized this was the moment I'd been waiting for my whole life, the chance to do something that mattered, to break the cycle of fear and hate and teach Eli what it truly meant to be a man. Sometimes all it takes is a single act, a cup of water, a glimmer of mercy, to change not only your own fate, but the future of everyone you love. And out here on the edge of everything, that's the bravest thing a man can do. A man's choices on the frontier are never made in a vacuum. Out here, each decision can ripple across a lifetime, sometimes across generations. As I knelt there by the well holding the water bucket to that wounded Apache's lips, I felt the weight of 1,000 unspoken rules pressing down on my shoulders. Fear, suspicion, and pride, all of them were as much a part of the land as the dust and the thirst. I could almost hear my neighbors' voices in the wind, those hard-eyed men who'd carved their ranches out of stone and sweat just like me. "Don't you dare," they'd say. "You give a savage mercy, you bring his whole tribe down on your house. Next time it'll be your own son bleeding in the dirt." These were men who believed that kindness was a weakness, that compassion for the wrong person was a threat, not just to your safety, but to the very foundation of your world. And God help me, part of me believed it too. Eli stood close, his small hand wrapping around the faded hem of my shirt. I could feel his eyes on me, searching for answers I wasn't sure I had. I remembered the times I'd told him that a man's job was to protect his own, to keep his promises, to stand his ground. Now, as I watched that Apache drink, as if each swallow might be his last, I realized there was another lesson, a deeper one I'd been avoiding for years. I saw the uncertainty flicker in Eli's gaze, the raw, unfiltered empathy only a child can feel, unclouded by the scars of old grievances or the stories told around campfires. For him, it was simple. Someone was suffering. Someone needed help. But for me, the calculations tangled like barbed wire inside my chest. I thought of my wife's voice, soft and warm on cold nights. It doesn't matter where a man was born, only what he chooses when it counts. But the world beyond our ranch didn't think that way. The law out here was as brutal and direct as a thunderclap. It didn't matter that my wife was buried under a lone cottonwood, or that I'd spent years trying to keep my boy's innocence intact. If word got out that I'd harbored an Apache, worse, if I was seen as helping an enemy, there'd be no court, no trial, no forgiveness. Webb and his men would come riding with their badges and their rifles, and all the neighbors I'd shared harvests and hardships with would turn away, shaking their heads and muttering about Hartwell's folly. I'd seen it before. Last winter, a farmer up near the river tried to hide a family of Comanche from a posse. They found him swinging from his own barn rafters come spring, and nobody dared speak his name again. Still, as I crouched beside the wounded stranger, those old warnings started to ring hollow. There was no war party waiting in the trees, just one broken young man fighting to stay alive. His hand trembled as he lowered the bucket, his lips red with water and blood. He tried to speak again, but only managed a whisper, words I couldn't understand. I saw something in his eyes, a desperate gratitude so raw it made me feel ashamed for every moment I'd hesitated. I thought of the times I'd gone thirsty in my own life, thirsty for water, for hope for a world where doing the right thing wasn't always punished. I looked at Eli, who was still watching me, waiting for my next move. Was I raising a boy to survive or to live with honor? Would he learn to be brave enough to risk himself for a stranger, or only ever strong enough to lock the door? The choice should have been clear, but it wasn't. It felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, the ground shifting beneath my boots, every instinct screaming for me to step back, to take the safe road, to let the world remain as it always was. But Eli's voice broke the silence, soft but steady. "Is he going to die, Pa?" I didn't answer right away. I watched the Apache's chest rise and fall, the blood pooling slowly at his side, the wind tugging at the bandages I'd just wrapped as best I could. Finally, I shook my head. "Not if we can help it, son." I thought about hiding the stranger in the barn, but it was too obvious, too exposed. The old root cellar behind the smokehouse, half collapsed and full of cobwebs, was the only place he'd stand a chance if the law came sniffing around. I helped him up, half carrying his weight, feeling the heat of fever through his torn shirt. He didn't protest. He barely had the strength to stand. As I led him toward the cellar, Eli ran ahead, opening the rusted door, clearing a space in the straw with his bare hands. For the first time since my wife died, I felt something like hope blooming in my chest. Not hope for myself, but for the kind of world Eli might grow up to inherit, a world where the line between enemy and neighbor was drawn not in blood, but in choices. After settling the Apache down and covering him with an old blanket, I pressed a canteen into his hands and whispered, "Rest. I'll be back." As I climbed out, the reality of what I'd done hit me like a blow. I was now an outlaw in the eyes of my own people, a traitor to the code I'd lived by for years. But looking back at Eli mud on his cheeks, eyes shining with pride, I knew I'd chosen right. Whatever storm came next, I'd face it, knowing I'd given my boy more than a lesson in survival. I'd given him a lesson in humanity. Sometimes the bravest thing a man can do isn't drawing a gun or holding his tongue, but opening a door to someone the world has already cast out. And in that moment, deep in the Texas dust, I discovered that real courage is measured not by how many men fear you, but by how much mercy you can carry when the world says you shouldn't. By late afternoon, the sky had taken on that peculiar faded hue you only ever see out here, somewhere between blue and bronze, like the world itself was holding its breath. I tried to keep busy, splitting logs, checking the fence line, anything to keep my mind from spiraling down the what-ifs that trailed me like a hungry coyote. Every so often I'd glance toward the smokehouse, where the old root cellar now hid, not potatoes, but the one secret that could undo everything Eli and I had ever built. It was hard not to imagine what would happen if the world found out, if someone saw a boot print a spot of blood on the porch, or if the wrong eyes caught sight of a shadow moving behind the woodpile. My neighbors were good men, mostly, but the kind of good that's built on fear and shared enemies. The bonds that held us together, brandings, barn raisings. The Sunday suppers could unravel in an instant if the right word or the wrong secret slipped loose. Eli was quieter than usual. He kept close, trailing after me with a bundle of kindling, his eyes darting to the horizon. He was old enough to sense when danger was thick in the air. I'd catch him peering through the slats of the barn lips, moving in silent prayers. That evening, as the sun bled out behind the hills, we heard it, the dull, thunderous beat of hooves on hardpan, the kind that sends birds shrieking from the cottonwoods and makes your bones hum with warning. I stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand, Eli peeking from behind my leg. 6 riders broke over the ridge dust rising behind them, like a warning flag, the golden light catching on gunmetal and badges. At the head rode Marshal Dixon Webb. Even from a distance, he was unmistakable, a big man broad in the shoulder, his face weathered by sun and anger, eyes pale as river ice. He carried himself with the slow, heavy confidence of a man used to giving orders and having them obeyed, no questions asked. Rumor had it, Webb once rode all the way to Santa Fe just to drag a horse thief back in chains, and the only reason he brought him back alive was to watch him hang. I'd never had trouble with him personally, but I'd seen the way folks changed when Webb was near straighter backs. Fewer words, as if the mere presence of the law was enough to choke the air. His deputies fanned out behind him, faces set, hands hovering near their holsters. Among them I spotted Carter, the youngest, nervous eyes, lips pressed tight. I wondered what brought them all the way out here. My heart stuttered as Webb slowed his horse, stopping a few feet from the porch. "Afternoon, Hartwell," he drawled, voice low and polite, but with an edge sharp enough to cut through wire. "Afternoon, Marshal," I replied, steadying my grip on the rifle, forcing myself to meet his gaze. "What brings you this far out?" Webb gestured toward the well, his eyes never leaving mine. "We're tracking a wounded Apache. Bad business. Blood trail runs right through your property." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. I felt Eli shrink behind me. I forced a shrug, trying for calm I didn't feel. "Haven't seen any strangers, Marshal. Me and the boy have been working the south fence all day." Webb's gaze flicked past me, landing on a dark stain near the well, a patch I'd scrubbed for 10 minutes that morning, but hadn't managed to erase. His mouth curved in a humorless smile. "That's so." He dismounted, boots crunching on gravel spurs, glinting in the low light. "Funny thing, that sure looks like blood." Behind me, Eli tensed. For a moment, the only sound was the creak of saddle leather and the nervous shifting of horses. Webb stepped closer, hand resting casually on his pistol. His deputies spread out, forming a half circle. It was a show of force, but also a warning. Any sudden move, any hint of a lie, and things could turn ugly in a heartbeat. Carter lingered at the edge, eyes darting between Webb and me, as if he was seeing ghosts. "Mind if we look around?" Webb asked, though his tone made it clear it wasn't really a question. I nodded, forcing myself to breathe, pulse thudding in my throat. As they moved about the property, I walked with Webb, keeping him away from the smokehouse as best I could. Each step felt like wading through mud. The deputies poked through the barn, peered into the chicken coop, even checked the tool shed. Webb kept up his questions, each one probing a little deeper. "You hear any shots last night? Anyone come asking for water?" I shook my head, lying as smoothly as I dared, knowing any crack in my story could doom us all. My palms were slick with sweat, and I kept Eli close, squeezing his shoulder each time Webb's gaze lingered too long. One of the neighbors, Mr. Grady, who lived 2 miles west, had joined the search. He was the sort who smiled with his mouth, never with his eyes. Grady wandered near the smokehouse, pausing to wipe his brow. My heart hammered so loud I was sure he'd hear it. Webb called out to him, drawing him away just in time, but I saw the suspicion flicker on Grady's face. This wasn't a search. It was a warning, a show of power meant to remind me and everyone watching who decided what was right and wrong in this country. When the search turned up, nothing. Webb circled back, eyes colder now. "You know what happens to folks who hide fugitives. Hartwell, whole towns have burned for less." I met his gaze, refusing to blink. "I'm just trying to keep my boy safe, Marshal. That's all any of us can do." For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then Webb nodded, slow and deliberate, like a man who's marked his prey and will wait for the kill. He turned to Carter, barking orders to keep an eye on things, then swung up onto his horse. "We'll be back," he promised, voice flat as the horizon. As the riders disappeared into the dusk, Eli pressed close to my side. Did we do the right thing, Pa? He whispered. I looked at my son, his face full of fear and hope, innocence and worry all tangled together. I didn't answer, not right away. All I knew was that the line between good and evil had never felt thinner, nor the cost of kindness more steep. The law had come and gone, but danger still lingered like the taste of gunpowder in the air, and I knew the storm was only just beginning. Out here, mercy had a price, and before long we'd have to pay it one way or another. After Webb and his posse disappeared over the horizon, the ranch sank into a strained, heavy silence, the kind that seemed to soak into the bones of the land itself. Dusk rolled in slow, a burnt orange, bleeding into purple shadows across the far hills. I busied myself chopping wood, checking the latches on the barn, anything to distract my mind from the knowledge that danger wasn't gone. It had just changed shape. Eli was quiet, too, still glancing over his shoulder as if the lawman might materialize from the gathering dark. I felt the same gnawing dread, but I couldn't show it. Out here, a boy looks to his father for strength, even if it's only for show. After a while, when the yard was safe and the world seemed to pause, I made my way to the smokehouse and down into the root cellar, lantern in hand. The Apache lay there, shivering despite the heat, eyes glassy with fever and pain. I knelt by his side and offered more water, gently checking the wound. It was ugly, a torn mess stitched in blood and dust, with the black rim of gunpowder burns around it. No accident, no hunting mistake. Someone had meant to kill him up close. "You're safe here," I murmured, though my own voice sounded hollow. For a moment he just stared at me, suspicion and gratitude flickering in his gaze. Then, voice hoarse, he tried to speak. "Name's Ayanna." His English was careful, shaped by years spent listening more than speaking. "I need to get to the council. Must warn them." I frowned, unsure what kind of message could be worth dying for. Warn them about what I asked. He coughed, clutching his side. "Peace is in danger. There are men who profit from blood, white men, maybe Apache too. They don't want treaty. They want war." He paused to catch his breath, eyes burning with an old pain. I saw them. They wear paint like my people, but their words are wrong. They killed the Colonel Morrison. They framed me so the treaty would die with me. His hand trembled as he reached for a pouch tied to his belt. He pulled out a folded, blood-stained letter and pressed it into my palm. Morrison wrote this the night he died. Names, dates, proof. The truth hit me like a cold wind. This wasn't some chance encounter, a wounded wanderer stumbling into my yard. It was a fuse burning straight toward every farm, every home, every man, woman, and child who thought the peace between settlers and Apache was a shield against the world's cruelty. The letter, warm with his blood, was evidence enough to start or stop a war. The scale of it made my legs weak. All the stories told in town, the hushed talk of missing rifles, cattle raids that never made sense, whispered rumors about someone in the marshal's office taking bribes here, was the bloody core of it, clutched in the hand of a dying man who'd risked everything for the truth. Ayanna's eyes searched mine, desperate and defiant at once. If I die here, war comes. They win. I looked at him, no longer just an Apache, but a man standing at the crossroads of history, carrying the burden for both his people and mine. I thought of Eli asleep in his bed, his small body safe for now, but never far from danger in a land that could change with the wind. I thought of the neighbors who would burn my house to the ground if they knew what I held in my hands. I thought of the years spent teaching my son that courage meant more than pulling a trigger. At that moment, footsteps overhead made us both tense. I put a finger to my lips. The hatch creaked open, lantern light spilling down, and there stood Deputy Carter, his silhouette sharp against the gloom. He'd come back alone, and his face looked carved from stone, the kind of face a young man wears when he knows he's about to change his own life. "I heard voices," he said quietly. "And I saw blood on your hands, Hartwell. For a moment I braced for betrayal, but Carter surprised me. The Marshal's not what he seems. None of this is. He looked at Ayanna, then back at me. There's been talk rifle shipments gone missing, gold-changing hands raids that end too clean. My own pa told me never to trust a badge more than a man's word. I want to do what's right, but I need to know is what he says true. I handed Carter the letter. He read in the lantern glow, his hands shaking. When he finished, he knelt by Ayanna's side, voice low. I can help you get to the council, but it won't be easy. Webb's got half the town stirred up folks, itching for a fight, blaming every problem on the Apache. He looked at me, eyes full of fear and resolve. But if we don't try, there won't be anything left to save. The three of us sat in silence, the weight of the conspiracy pressing on us all. For the first time, I saw how little separated us, Apache lawman rancher, when it came to choosing between comfort and courage. I realized that true loyalty wasn't to the laws written by frightened men, but to the truths we found in moments like this, when the world demanded we choose sides not out of hate, but out of hope for something better. Above us, the night deepened. Somewhere a coyote howled a thin, mournful note in the endless dark. Tomorrow we'd have to move to risk everything for a chance to set things right. The odds were long, the dangers real. But sitting there in that dusty cellar, I knew I would not turn back. I would help Ayanna reach his people. For my son. For the memory of my wife. For the hope that just maybe the blood spilled here tonight could be the last for a while at least on this hard and hungry land. The night before the storm broke, I barely slept. Fear gnawed at my gut, and every creak of the house made me grip the rifle a little tighter. I checked on Ayanna again and again, in the root cellar watching the fever fight him, willing his battered body to hold out just one more day. Carter slept in the barn loft, shotgun at his side, the set of his jaw making him look older than his years. It was a makeshift alliance, one rancher, a wounded Apache, and a lawman, torn by conscience, held together by nothing but hope and the thin thread of truth. Sometimes in the West, that's all you get. Just before dawn, I heard the first hoofbeats, slow, measured, deliberate. I woke Eli and told him to stay close, promising him that whatever happened, he would not be alone. The horizon glowed pale gold, and through the morning haze I saw Webb and his deputies returning with a handful of townsfolk riding behind them. Webb's silhouette looked even more ominous in the gray light, the wide-brimmed hat casting his eyes in shadow, his hand never straying far from the butt of his pistol. The men fanned out across the yard, rifles, slung boots crunching on the frosted grass. Eli clung to my side, but I could feel his spine stiffen. He understood that a test was coming, not just for me, but for everything I'd taught him about right and wrong. Webb dismounted, first stepping forward with the confident swagger of a man who believes the law lives in his holster. "Mornin' Hartwell," he called, voice louder than necessary. "We're back for another look. Had word that you've been harboring trouble. Best step aside and let us handle things." His deputies shifted hands, twitching, some eyes hard, others uncertain. Carter moved to stand beside me, shotgun low but ready. The message was clear. This time the lines were drawn. I squared my shoulders, feeling the air crackle between us. "You know there's no trouble here, Marshal. Just me and my boy." "You've searched once already." Webb's lips curled, more snarl than smile. Funny thing about trouble, it tends to hide. And I don't take kindly to men who lie for the sake of a savage. My blood ran cold, but I held my ground. Behind me I heard the faint creak of the root cellar hatch, Ayanna rising to face the day, maybe to face his end. Then something shifted in the yard, a ripple of tension, as if the land itself was bracing for violence. Carter took a half step forward. "Marshal," he said, voice steady but thin with nerves, "maybe we ought to think twice before we go tearing this place apart. Man's got a right to protect his home." Webb's eyes narrowed, dangerous and calculating. You siding with them now, Carter. You forget who wears the star, Carter. Didn't back down. I know what I heard. There's more going on here than you're telling. And if Ayana's right, if there's a frame-up, if men are selling out their own for gold, then maybe it's time we stop listening to fear. That was when Ayana stepped into the pale morning light, his face pale but resolute, every movement deliberate despite the pain that etched deep lines around his mouth. He stood tall, shoulders squared, meeting Webb's gaze without flinching. The sight of him out in the open made Webb's hand jerk toward his pistol, but Carter raised his shotgun, blocking the line of fire. No more blood, Marshal Carter said, his voice shaking but determined. Not today. Webb's deputies hesitated, glancing at each other, some visibly wavering. The townsfolk at the edge of the yard, men I'd known my whole life, looked uneasy, shifting their weight from foot to foot, caught between loyalty to the badge and something older, some memory of right and wrong that ran deeper than fear. For a moment everything hung, suspended, the sun rising over the hills, the scent of wood smoke in the air, the memory of 1,000 injustices balanced on the tip of a finger. Ayana raised his hand, palm open, the universal sign of peace. "I come not to fight," he said, voice strong despite the tremor. "I come to bring truth." He told them of the letter, of Colonel Morrison's murder, of the men who wore paint to deceive, of bribes paid, and weapons stolen, all of it, spilling out in a river of pain and hope. Carter held up the letter, reading aloud the names, the dates, the evidence that tied men in power to the chaos, threatening both settlers and Apache alike. Webb's face turned ashen rage flickering beneath his skin. "You're a fool if you think anyone will believe the word of an Indian and a traitor deputy," he spat. But now the crowd was listening, their anger melting into doubt, their eyes searching the faces of their neighbors. One by one, Webb's deputies began to lower their weapons. Carter spoke up stronger now. "If the law isn't about justice, then it's just another gang. I didn't sign on for that." Webb spun, desperate pistol flashing in the sun. He aimed for Ayana, for Carter, for me it was hard to tell. I moved without thinking, tackling Webb, the two of us crashing to the ground in a tangle of dust and fury. His pistol clattered away, landing at Eli's feet. My son stared down, uncertain, then kicked the weapon far out of reach. The yard erupted in shouts, deputies restraining Webb townsfolk, calling for calm, Carter hauling the marshal to his feet with the weight of a man who'd chosen his path come what may. Ayana stood over us, breath ragged, but in his eyes I saw not triumph, but relief, a burden shared at last. I looked at Eli, his face pale but proud, and knew we had crossed a river that could never be uncrossed. In that morning's golden light, the old order was broken. Webb, stripped of his power and his mask of law, was just a man, scared, angry, defeated. Carter, shaking but resolute, handed the letter to the crowd. Ayana, exhausted but alive, had won, not with bullets, but with truth. And I, just a rancher who gave a cup of water, found myself at the heart of a storm that had finally spent itself. Sometimes all it takes to change the West is one person brave enough to say enough, and another willing to stand beside him no matter the cost. The dust had hardly settled before the world shifted on its axis. For a long, breathless moment, the yard seemed frozen in place. Webb's rage burning out into exhausted silence, the townsfolk and deputies blinking in the rising sun, as if waking from a fever dream. I lay there on the ground, heart pounding, Webb's weight heavy against my shoulder as Carter dragged him up, iron in his grip. The old rules, the ones we'd all lived by, the ones that had taught us to shoot first and bury the questions, suddenly seemed brittle as dried grass, and the only law left was the one written in our hearts. Ayana leaned heavily against the well, blood seeping slowly through his bandages, face drawn with pain, but eyes shining fierce and alive. For the first time since he'd stumbled onto my ranch, he didn't look like a fugitive or a ghost from some other world. He looked like a man battered, brave, and unbroken, who'd carried a nation's hope on his shoulders through fire and betrayal. He met my gaze, nodded once, and in that small gesture, I felt the bridge between our worlds finally span the chasm that fear and hatred had dug for generations. Carter called for quiet, his voice steady but not harsh, a young lawman made old by a night's courage. He held the letter high, reading Morrison's words one last time, every name and detail rolling out across the assembled men like the thunder that sometimes follows the clearest sunrise. There was a hush deep and wide while the townsfolk listened, their anger giving way to something more honest, shame, wonder, and a stirring hope that maybe, just maybe, the old story could end differently this time. A few men lowered their eyes. Grady, who'd once threatened to torch my barn if he ever caught me helping their kind, wiped his face and muttered something about not knowing how deep the rot went. The lie at the heart of our peace had been torn open and exposed to the light. There would be no going back. Webb stripped of his gun, and his badge tried one last time to twist the world back to the shape he knew. "You're fools," he spat, voice hoarse, "if you trust an Apache over your own kind. Everything you built'll burn the minute you turn your back." But even his deputies no longer stood behind him. They looked away or stared at their boots, men suddenly unsure of which direction led home. Carter's jaw tightened. "Maybe it's time we build something new, Marshal, something that doesn't start with blood." It was then that we heard the distant drum of hoofbeats, soft at first, then growing louder, steadier, a wave cresting over the hills. Dozens of Apache riders, their faces solemn eyes, watchful, surrounded the ranch at a respectful distance. At their head rode an old man, his braids silvered with age, his posture proud as any general. I recognized him from Ayana's whispered stories, the chief father and judge the keeper of the peace that men like Morrison and Ayana had tried to forge. He dismounted without hurry, crossing the yard with a steady grace, and stopped before Ayana. For a moment the world shrank to a father's hands on his son's shoulders, to the murmured blessing in a language older than the barbed wire that divided our lands. Then the chief turned to the rest of us, eyes dark and clear, and spoke English that was soft, deliberate, and impossible to misunderstand. "My son is alive because one man showed mercy," he said, looking at me, "because one child did not learn hate." He looked around the yard, letting the words settle, then nodded to Carter and the others. "Today we will honor justice, not vengeance." The Apache warriors dismounted, laying their weapons on the ground in a circle, a symbol older than the town, older than the names on the land grants. I felt Eli's hand slip into mine, his small fingers trembling, and I realized I was crying tears I hadn't shed since my wife's funeral. Tears for all the losses and second chances, and the thin, bright hope that somehow this place might heal. Webb and his last loyal deputy were taken into custody by Carter, by the townsfolk, by the quiet authority of a community that had found its conscience. There would be a trial now, not a lynching. The evidence Ayana carried would travel east with the chief and Carter, to the capital where justice might actually have a chance to be heard, above the old noise of fear. As for Ayana, the medicine men saw to his wound, murmuring prayers and tending him with care. Before he left, he took me aside, pressed a feathered lance into my hands, the very one the chief had carried for decades, and looked me in the eye. "Today you are brother," he said, voice breaking just a little. "You changed the story for both our peoples. The ranch, so long a place of isolation and wary peace, became for a moment a crossroads of cultures, of choices of futures, yet unwritten. The townsfolk, at first uneasy, soon shared coffee and bread with the Apache children, sneaking peeks and giggling at the painted ponies. Carter, no longer just a badge, was a bridge, a young man who had chosen right over easy, who would, I suspected, never see the world in simple colors again. When the sun finally began to slip behind the ridgeline, Ayana and the Apache prepared to ride. Carter shook my hand, his grip strong and sure. "We'll keep fighting for this," he promised. "It's not over, but maybe now there's a chance." Eli hugged Ayana's leg, and the Apache ruffled his hair, laughing softly. I stood with the feathered lance in my hands, knowing it was more than a gift. It was a reminder that in the West, the bravest thing a man could do wasn't firing a gun or building a fence, but reaching across the line the world had drawn and offering mercy to a stranger. As the riders disappeared into the twilight and the yard filled with the soft sounds of a community waking up from a long, fearful sleep, I looked down at Eli. "Did we do the right thing, Pa?" he whispered. I pulled him close. "I reckon we did, son. Sometimes that's all a man can do. The old stories would linger and danger would never be far in a land as wild as this. But for that one day at least, we had chosen hope over hate, and that I believed was the beginning of something worth living for." Long after the last hoofbeats faded into the dusk and the yard had emptied of strangers and neighbors alike, I stood alone on the porch, the weight of the day finally pressing down on me. The wind had picked up, carrying with it the sense of trampled grass, wood smoke, and something sweeter hope, maybe, though I barely recognized it at first. Eli was inside asleep, in the big bed that still smelled faintly of his mother's lavender soap, clutching a painted feather Ayana had left for him as a talisman against nightmares. For the first time in months, he'd fallen asleep without asking if the doors were locked or if the world beyond our walls would ever be safe again. I stayed outside as darkness deepened, listening to the night creatures call and the silence that follows a storm. The feathered lance Ayana and his father had given me leaned against the door frame, catching moonlight in its beads and fletching. It was more than a gift. It was a reminder of everything that had changed and of how much work was still ahead. I traced my fingers over the worn wood, feeling the grooves left by other hands, other generations, and I wondered how many times those hands had offered help or demanded war. Out here on the frontier, stories like mine and Ayana's rarely ended in peace. I knew that. But tonight, as the stars spilled over the horizon and the land exhaled, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, a new story was possible. I remembered every moment of that day in perfect detail, the fear, the rage, the split-second decisions that could have turned fatal. I remembered the faces of my neighbors as the truth was revealed, the way old Grady looked away, the awe in the children's eyes as Apache and settler shared bread beneath my cottonwood tree. I remembered the way Carter's voice cracked as he promised justice, not vengeance, and the look on Ayana's face as he accepted the lance from his father, honor and relief, and something like forgiveness all tangled together. Most of all, I remembered the way Eli looked at me, that pure, wondering trust that only a child can offer. I had spent years telling myself that strength was all that mattered, that a man's worth was measured by how well he kept danger from his door. But in the end, it wasn't my strength that changed anything. It was the choice to offer mercy, the willingness to see another man's pain as my own, the simple act of refusing to let fear draw the boundaries of my heart. There was a time when I would have called that weakness, when the world was smaller and angrier, and I believed that good fences and loaded guns were all a man needed to sleep through the night. But today I'd learned that real courage lives in the moments when you break your own rules, when you stand up in the face of your own doubts and say, "No, this is not who we have to be." It was never really about me and Ayana, or even about the law and the Apache. It was about the stories we choose to pass down, the truths we teach our children, the small, quiet acts that add up to something much bigger than ourselves. I realized that while violence and hatred can change the shape of a land, only compassion can change the shape of a soul. As the moon rose, painting the plains in silver, I thought of my wife, and how she always believed that goodness was a seed you planted, even if you never saw it, flower. I thought of Eli curled up safe, the dreams he'd carry into his own future. I thought of Ayana and the chief, riding into the night, the fragile hope of peace, held together by nothing more than a letter, a lance, and a handful of men and women willing to risk everything for a chance at something better. I wondered if the world would remember us, or if our story would be buried under the weight of 1,000 others' tales of blood and vengeance, victories won by force instead of faith. But I decided it didn't matter. What mattered was what I would remember. That once, when fear was thick as smoke and the world seemed set on burning itself down, I had the courage to say yes to a stranger, to hand him a cup of water and a place to rest. That a lawman found the strength to listen to his own conscience. That my son learned by watching, not just by hearing, that kindness is the greatest legacy a man can leave behind. We were just a handful of souls on the edge of a wild and dangerous country, but for one day we changed the ending. We chose a different story. So if you're listening, if you're wondering whether your small choices can matter in a world as hard and unforgiving as this, believe me, they do. Sometimes history is changed, not by the men with the fastest guns or the sharpest tongues, but by those who offer a hand, a word, a cup of water. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply to be kind. As the night finally claimed the ranch, and the wind swept the last traces of the day into the tall grass, I turned for the door, the feathered lance shining at my side, and whispered a promise to the darkness. This is the story I will tell. This is the legacy I will leave. And in the quiet I almost thought I heard the land itself answer a hush of hope carried on the wind as eternal as the stars.